Listen to the story about a love more faithful in the morning. The Father gave His only Son just to save us.
Sarah and I got married in October of 2005, October 14th, 2005. And because it was in the fall and Sarah was a teacher, a school teacher, she taught high school French for 9 years at Oswego High, northwest suburbs of Chicago. Because it was the fall and it wasn't fall break and there wasn't an extended time of vacation, we couldn't take our honeymoon right after we got married there in October 2005. So we actually ended up taking our honeymoon in June of 2006. Ended up going down to Mexico, one of those all-inclusive deals. It was one of the best weeks of my life. It was an awesome vacation, and really one of the things that makes a vacation so great is that everything works out okay with all of the travel and accommodations and things like that. And to be honest with you, going to Mexico from Chicago O'Hare, we lived at the time, that wasn't a problem at all. Where we ran into a little bit of difficulty was when we were coming back from Mexico and flying into O'Hare in Chicago. Like I said, there'd been no problems whatsoever, getting in and out of the country and all of that. But when the resort dropped us off from a van at the airport in Mexico City, Sarah and I were waiting in line. We dropped off our luggage to get it all checked and all that kind of stuff. And then we walked up to the desk where they, check your passport and tickets and all that kind of stuff. And so Sarah handed her passport to the attendant behind the desk, and she looked at it, and then she typed some stuff in the computer, looked at it again, looked at Sarah's ticket, handed it back to her and said, "Enjoy your flight, Mrs. Lowry." And then I handed her my passport, and the attendant behind the desk looked at my passport, typed some stuff in the computer, took a moment to read, looked back at my passport, looked at the computer again, and she goes, "I'll be back in just a moment." And so she disappears for a little while. I look over at Sarah, I'm like, this is kind of weird. And eventually she came back out, and she handed me my passport with this big smile, and she said, "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Lowry." And I said, "Okay." So we made our way onto the flight, and we were flying back to Chicago, watching whatever movie they had planned, talking about how great the week was. And then we landed in Chicago at O'Hare. Everyone jumps up out of the seats, ready to get off the plane, ready to head home. And it seems like we're standing forever in the aisle of the plane. And it's taking forever for us to get off of this plane. And everyone's asking, well, what's the holdup? What's going on? Are they not ready for us? Because we knew we'd gone all the way to, when you walk down that long hallway to the airport, we were there ready to go. And then eventually, bit by bit, just shuffling down the aisle, we all started to exit the plane, walk down that long hallway. When Sarah and I got on that long hallway deal that connects to the airport, I was kind of looking up over the people ahead, and I realized there were 2 cops at the end of this long line of people. And what they were doing is they were checking everyone's passports. And so Sarah goes to the right, there's one cop on the right and one cop on the left. Sarah goes to the cop on the right, hands her passport. I go to the cop on my left, and I hand him my passport, and he looks at it, and he calls over to his partner and said, "Okay, we've got him." And I said, You've got me? Like, what exactly does that mean? And the guy says to his partner, you go ahead and walk with her if they're together, and I'll walk with him. And I'm looking back at Sarah. Sarah's got to look like, what did you do? And so, I'm walking in front of Sarah with this one cop, and he won't let me talk to her. And the whole time this cop, he has his hand kind of on my elbow, and he's guiding me along. And I said, "Can you tell me what's going on here?" And he goes, "Sir, when we get to where we need to go, I'll go ahead. I have some questions for you." And I'm scared to death, obviously. Sarah's behind me and tells me later that the whole time that they're just rushing us through O'Hare, and this is how I knew we were in trouble. When it came to customs, the guy flashes his badge. We get right through customs, clearly something is wrong here. And the whole time that Sarah's walking with the other cop, he's asking her all kinds of questions. What was the nature of your business in Mexico? So you're married. How long have you been married? How long did you know him before you got married? So he's just asking her all kinds of questions like this. And this one policeman takes me along, and basically when we arrive right around the area where there's this luggage crowd, where you can do the baggage claim, this one policeman grabs me more firmly by the elbow and says, "Why don't you walk over this way, over by this door?" And like in an airport, you see all these doors along the hallways, right? And you think that's probably just like a custodian's closet or something like that. The deal is when that guy opened that door, there's a whole episode of 24 going on behind the walls of airports, all right? And so I go into this whole office that's filled with all of these people, and the first thing that I always remember about this is that there was this huge table off to the side. that was filled with all kinds of stuff, including, I kid you not, this huge sword, like the kind of sword like a ninja has. And so immediately I walk in, I think to myself, if this is about the sword, that's not my sword. Like, I don't have a sword. Like, I didn't know what was going on. And the guy comes in and starts asking me all kinds of questions. What was the nature of your business in Mexico? How long have you been married? And this, that, and the other. And then he asked me one particularly curious question in which he said, when was the last time you were in Florida? And I thought to myself, I've got to get this question right. And so I'm trying to go through my mind. I think I went in 1996. It was my parents' 25th wedding anniversary. We all went together. I think that's what it was. I think it was 1996. And so he asked me all these questions, and all of a sudden he says, we'd like to run your fingerprints. So they're running my fingerprints. They have me stand there. They take my picture and all this. The lady who's working with the guy puts her thumbs up and says, he's clean. I'm like, I am clean, you know? And then finally the guy sits me down and says, let me tell you what's going on here. I have no idea why your passport didn't get pinged on the way to Mexico, but for some reason on the way back, it got our attention. It got the attention of the people down there in Mexico because here's what's going on. He says, this is crazy, I know. But there's another guy who's named Brian Philip Lowry. That's my full name. He was born on April 4th, 1978. That's my birthday. He has blonde hair, blue eyes, about as tall as you, weighs about the same as you, and even within his social security number, yeah, it's not the same, but there's enough numbers where, quite frankly, we didn't know if we had a guy who was wanted down in Florida for drug trafficking. So you've got to be kidding me. And the whole time, it's funny, later on, Sarah, they were kind of filling this in on Sarah so that she wasn't panicking. I don't know if she was really like full-on panicking, but I remember she told me she was outside with the other cop who was talking to me. She goes, my husband is not some criminal. I don't know what's going on. He's a minister, to which he replied, we get a lot of ministers around here. And then she goes further and says, no, he's not a criminal. Like, look in his bag. There's like commentaries. He's a nerd. So thanks for that defense, Sarah. But like I get out there and I tell Sarah, you're never going to believe this. Like there's another Brian Philip Lowry, born April 4th, 1978, blonde hair, blue eyes, looks like a lot like me, and he's a drug trafficker. They thought I was him and he was me. It was crazy. That's a really trippy thing for you to discover, you know? I mean, long after that, and all the years that have followed that in June of 2006, there's been a lot of moments, you know, where after that first day when my heart rate went down, I could change my pants. And I was thinking to myself, this is amazing to me. That on the same day was born this boy and his parents named him Brian Philip Lowry, April 4th, 1978. Like our timelines, you know what I mean? His and mine start at the same time. And yet two totally different directions. You know, Brian Philip Lowry, born April 4th, 1978, blonde hair, blue eyes, minister. Brian Philip Lowry, born April 4th, 1978, blonde hair, blue eyes, drug trafficker. There's been a lot of moments in my life where I thought to myself, like about those timelines and where are the similarities and yet where are the differences so that one of us ends up, for goodness sakes, doing ministry and the other ends up moving cocaine on the streets of Florida. Where are the similarities and where are the differences in our timelines so that one of us is holding on to life to whatever degree we know how, but the other one is, and you may think this is putting kind of judgmentally or crassly, but the other's just throwing it away. Two men, you know. I riffed on this last year for an Easter devotional, so I hope you'll go ahead and humor me on this because this year I found myself thinking about it again. The story of two men that takes place in really the last couple of days of Jesus' life. We've been going through the series called Vignettes, a vignette being a scene that unfolds the overall unfolding story. And there's a great deal of vignettes that unfold, especially on that final night when Jesus is taken away and arrested and moving on into the morning that we're celebrating here today, the moment that the tomb was found to be empty. A number of vignettes that star two men. Two men. The first one named Peter. I know we have the lights down today, so just listen. I just want you to listen. It's not up on the slides. Just listen to the story as it unfolds of this first man, whose name is Peter, one of the followers of Jesus. On the night before his death, Jesus was with his disciples, and he said to them, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And Peter answered Jesus, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, Peter, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And later that evening, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, a garden, to pray. And that's when Judas came, and with Judas a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. And the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and he said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him, and Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." And then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and they seized him. And then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see how it all would end. And a servant girl came up to Peter and said, "Hey, you also were with Jesus the Galilean." But Peter denied it before them, saying, I don't know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl, she saw him there, and she said to all the bystanders, "This guy over here, this man, he was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath, "I swear to you that I do not know the man." And after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them. Your accent, it betrays you. You're from the north, where he's been doing all of his ministry." And then Peter began to invoke even a curse on himself to swear, probably along the lines of the Old Testament. "May God deal with me ever so severely if I am lying to you when I say, I do not know this man." And immediately the rooster crowed. That's one man, Peter. Second man, Judas. The chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth in a vulnerable moment, in a moment he least expected it, when the people could not rise up and protect him so that they might then kill him. And one of the 12 who followed Jesus, his name was Judas Iscariot, he went to those chief priests and he said, "Okay, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, Judas sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. And one evening soon after, Jesus was with his disciples in a place called Gethsemane, a garden, gathered there to pray. And that's when Judas came. And with Judas a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. And now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, so you seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." And then they came up and they laid hands on Jesus and they seized him. And when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and they led him away and they delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. Now that's two men. Two different men. And I have to tell you, in the process of the illustration I gave you about me and this other Brian Philip Lowry, it's two men, and I know they don't have the same name, but in all honesty, when you listen to that, it's the same story. It's the same story. In so many different ways, I think you could take the name Peter and just swap it out for Judas, or take the name Judas and just swap it out for Peter. I mean, here's two of these guys, both of them followers of Jesus, and they had been with him for something like three and a half years. Scholars debate about how long. They'd been following around northern Galilee and then into southern Israel, but they'd been with him and they had been like family together. That's the nature of a relationship between a rabbi and those who followed him, is that there was this love, this cherishment, this desire to learn from one another, to do this kind of life together. Everywhere they went, meals together, sleeping in the same lodging, jokes that they had, inside jokes that they had, all of these beautiful moments that they had together, and that Jesus had given absolutely everything he had for them and for everyone. And yet in this moment when he needed them the most, where this was going to possibly cost him everything, that in a heartbeat, Peter and Judas both turned their back on him, recognizing that in that moment, if they do not stand for him, or in the case of Judas, if he doesn't nix this plan of striking at Jesus in his most vulnerable moment, that it might very well mean an innocent man goes into a sham of a trial where he isn't given due process, and he could be hung on a cross like a crook, and yet they abandon him. They realize that an innocent man is spiraling towards a death penalty here. And yet Peter, who Jesus has given everything for, in the moment where quite possibly he could be a character witness, or he could go and try and grab people together to clamor for the innocence of Jesus, he, by way of not just an oath, but a curse upon himself, says, I don't even know who this guy is, and runs into the night. And Judas, this man who's traveled with Jesus and realizes everything that he has given him and everything that he has given everybody else for just a handful of change, what translates into somewhere around $300, $315, $325 in today's currency. That's what it was for him to hand over the life of Jesus, an innocent man. Two men, two different names, but the same story, right? You might as well have the same name, Peter, Judas, Judas, Peter, both of them. Doing nothing or even doing something actively that an innocent man is barreling his way toward the death that only a crook or a criminal deserves. It's pretty deep stuff. It's pretty horrible stuff for them to have the blood of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, on their hands. And it's the kind of situation where, quite frankly, if someone were to come into your life and you're having lunch sometime, and you know what happens sometimes where you're starting to catch up on different things that are going on in different people's lives, if your friend would ever turn to you and tell a story similar to this one, strip it of the biblical context, but something playing out in modern day contemporary times, you would sit back and think to yourself, you've got to be kidding me. A guy handed over his friend for that, and an innocent man didn't say anything, didn't serve as a character witness, but turned his back on his friend. This other guy, for a handful of change, made sure this man could get killed. Like, if you heard that story after you picked your jaw up off the ground, the thing you would say is, that's abhorrent. That's the most disgusting, despicable person I've ever heard of. Unbelievable, inexcusable, unforgivable, right? It's disgusting what they did. And this abandonment cost Jesus his own life. And if you don't think they realized that, they realized it. Because here's the next moment in this story after they've handed Jesus over. The very next moment says, and after Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, he remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And so he went out and he wept bitterly. Judas, and when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind. And he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, and he said, oh, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. If you don't think they realized what they had done, they absolutely realized the critical devastation that they had introduced in the life of Jesus in that moment. Oh, they realized the depth of their sin. You have this scene with Peter, I imagine it, that he runs into the night, and at some point, everything that has just transpired overwhelms him, and he collapses up against the wall of some house on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and it says he began to weep bitterly. In a moment when he sat back and he thought to himself, this is a man who gave everything for me. I mean, you've heard maybe the gospel stories. Did Peter sit back and say, there was a moment where I was walking on water miraculously and I began to drown. And this man who could walk on water reached down and saved me. But he didn't just save me, but you remember the story from the Gospels. Peter's mother-in-law had been saved by Jesus. She was in the throes of this debilitating fever, and yet Jesus took her hand and cooled the fever. Peter sits back and realizes he has done everything for me. There's a man who went through the land and forgave all of these sins and allowed the crippled people to walk again and the blind to see. And yet in this moment, when I sat back and said, I will not deny you, even if it costs me my own life, I will stand by you. That in the moment someone even just merely asks if I was associated with him, I lie by way of even swearing an oath and calling down a curse. It's unbelievable, inexcusable, unforgivable what I've done. Be better off if I'd never been born. I deserve to die. He weeps bitterly. And Judas somewhere comes to his mind. The text says, you're going to think he realized what he did. It says in that moment he changed his mind. that at some point the scales fell from his eyes and he had been so angry with Jesus. I think part of the reason Judas hands him over is that Jesus just wasn't carrying things out the way that Judas wanted him to carry things out. And he was so frustrated and he was so impatient. And yet in the moment of that garden, as they take him away and he realizes this man is going to be condemned to die, that something about that shatters his heart. And he goes to the chief priests and tries to give them back the money in order that he can bring back the life of Jesus, and says, I realize that I have sinned before God by handing over an innocent man. This man who gave everything for me and everything for all, who made the crippled walk and the blind see and the deaf hear, could rise from the dead bodies, and I handed him over for a handful of change that I'm turning over in the palms of my hands. It's unbelievable what I've done. Inexcusable, unforgivable. It'd been better off if I'd never been born. I deserve to die. You don't think they realized what they'd done? Realized the heinous, abhorrent nature of it and thought to themselves, unforgivable. Two men, same story. And yet here's where their stories change. Listen to what Peter does next. And after Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, he remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and he wept bitterly. And then the Gospels tell us, though, that when he dried his eyes and left the shadows of that house he had collapsed against, he joined the other disciples hidden away in an upper room, waiting and praying. Fearful, yes. Doors locked, it says, yes. But hidden away room, waiting and praying to see what might happen next. There's this moment in the life of Peter where he sits back and he is indeed thinking to himself, it is unbelievable, inexcusable, unforgivable, the things that I have done. I deserve to die. I'd been better off if I'd never been born. And yet, maybe. This one man clings to the promise of maybe, that he sits back and he thinks to himself, but maybe, because in this moment what Jesus said is what he always followed back with, and I will be delivered to the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and I will be crucified, and I will be buried, I will be killed, I will be condemned and killed, and yet in 3 days I will rise. There was this promise of resurrection, and what he had promised me is that he would rise again from the dead. He promised all of us that, and maybe if that's what's happened, it's the kind of thing that we've seen before. I mean, he just healed Lazarus. What if God is able to do that in Jesus? And in that moment, if he rises again, and if I might run to him, the beautiful thing is there is enough of what he taught in which he spoke so much of forgiveness and of grace. There were moments when he sat back and he told a parable of forgiving someone 70 times 7 over. And there was a psalmist long before Jesus even spoke, which says, to our God who we will stand before is slow to anger and abounding in love. And Jesus comes along and says, I am God. I am God in flesh. I am the Son of God. And he was tying all these lines between the Old Testament and now into these new times in which we realize that if there's ever going to be any kind of forgiveness, it would be by blood. Because we've always known that life is in the blood. It's what we were taught when we were young growing up in Jewish culture. That if there's a sacrifice, that there is a way. And what greater sacrifice than human sacrifice? And so if he rises, then I will run to him and I will fall down before him and I will beg him, because maybe he will forgive me. And so you have Peter, who understands he has done something seemingly unforgivable, and yet he hangs on for just one more day, 2, 3 days. And then this, a thrilling, beautiful certainty. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they brought spices so that it might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who's going to roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw it. The stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, but he has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go and tell his disciples, and you tell Peter that he is going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." And soon after his resurrection from the dead, Jesus revealed himself to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, and he revealed himself in this way: Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. They were together, and Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We will go with you." And they went out and got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. And just as day was breaking, there was Jesus standing on the shore. They did not know it was Jesus, and Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" And they answered him, "No." And he said, "Cast the net on the other side of the boat, and you'll find some." And so they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And that disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment. He actually put on his clothes, and he threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. And when they got out on the land, they saw this fire and fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish that you've caught." And so Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter said to Jesus, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him a second time, "Tend my sheep." And then a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because Jesus said to him this the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Follow me." Again, Peter. Again. That's one man, Peter, the other man, Judas. His response. And when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? You take care of that yourself." And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, Judas departed. And he went and he hanged himself. Here's Judas, another man, the same story as Peter's. Thinking the same thing as Peter, "What have I done? Everything that I have done is unbelievable. It is inexcusable. It is unforgivable." And yet there is not even a hint of a moment of him thinking maybe, but only weighing all of the devastation of his actions and never being able to wrap his imagination around the words that Jesus said, that though I would be handed over to the chief priests and the leaders of the people, and that they would kill me, in 3 days I will rise. Judas can't wrap his mind around the possibility that maybe, if you come running, he will forgive. It's tragic. It destroys me to think to myself that you've got these two men here. And yet their stories, I talk about their timelines diverting from one another. Their stories could have been exactly the same. And that destroys me. That just as quickly the story of Peter could have been the story of Judas. Don't you believe that? And scholars and theologians want to argue to no end that Judas was cursed and didn't have any kind of choice. And if that's the case, then quite frankly, we would have to believe that he was damned to hell and there was nothing he could possibly do. And yet the thing that makes me want to push back against that kind of thinking and to embrace the idea that what was for Peter could have been for Judas is this beautiful moment. And it just pierces my heart that in the moment where they are standing in the garden and there stands Jesus and Judas comes along with the mob, what is the very first word that is uttered to Judas when Jesus locks eyes with him? Friend. Friend. And it's one word, but you cannot help but embrace this idea that within that one word is this invitation. Judas, you are going to hate yourself for what you are about to do. But when I rise, you come running. Because this does not have to end. Destroys me. These two men could have had the same story. It was his. He could have been there on that morning, jumping into the sea with Peter and having breakfast with Jesus and being able to be restored through a calling, a commissioning again. Jesus calls out to all the disciples who fled him. Remember the first words he says to them in John is, "Children, have you caught any fish?" You're still my children. Two men, same story, but stories that take two radically different directions. One man who holds on to maybe and is restored. Another man who shuffles off again into the night and he slings a bit of rope over a low-hanging branch that is just high enough for him to do what he feels he has to do because it's so unforgivable. Two men, same story, one man, Jesus, making all the difference. Two men, Brian Philip Lowry, born April 4th, 1978. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Now, I have found myself many times since that day that I learned there's this other kind of bizarro Brian Lowry that I've had this moment where I've tried to think through the timeline of life for both of us, where I started and where he started. And quite frankly, when I start out, all I think to myself is all of the similarities of life for me, Brian Philip Lowry, and this other Brian Philip Lowry, I guess maybe living in Florida, for all I know, that for so long in our lives, our timelines are exactly the same. Now, I'm not an idiot. I know there's differences. I know we were born into different home lives, and I know that there were all kinds of differences in maybe the way we spoke and the way we dressed and the different advantages and experiences that we had. But at the very beginning, to the very least, when everything starts out, it's exactly the same. We're born, we learn to roll over, we learn to crawl, we learn to walk, we learn to run, we learn to ride a bike. We learn how to form words, how to write words. We're just learning how to live life, and everything is so similar despite some of the differences that we have. It's just learning to put one foot in front of the other. And here's where the similarities continue in our timelines. Is that at some point, right away, we started to get ourselves into trouble. Because what's the great equalizer in human beings between you and me that swallows it all up to the point where we both could just swap out each other's names? The great equalizer is a word called depravity. It's quite frankly, you are selfish and I am selfish, and it creates a whole lot of a mess in the world. And so the similarity is that me and this other Brian, we're both depraved, and we're both chasing out the things that we want to do. No, we don't care about all the destruction in the wake of what we do. And it might start out small. It always starts out small. It's the kind of thing that talking back to our parents or lying and cheating in school, cutting off all the hair of your sister's Barbies. And it can start really small, all of these things. But over time, as you grow intellectually and you grow experientially, you know this to be true. You had this real advantage in your life in which this real reality that you start to degrade morally. You start to piece all together all these ways that you can say, you know what, I don't know if that's really all that bad. I don't know if that really causes all that much destruction. And so what starts out small just gets bigger and bigger, like the snowball effect. And that's where I know our stories are still similar. I don't know everything he did. I can't speak for that Brian Philip Lowry, but I can speak for this Brian. And I'm not proud of the way that I lived my life. I mean, your younger years, especially your college years, when you're trying this, saying that, doing that. I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to lose my job. But me and this Brian, at some point, there were moments where we started to test borders and boundaries even more so. Shouldn't have thought that. Shouldn't have looked at that. Shouldn't have said that. Shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have questioned that. And all of this begins to grow more and more until all of a sudden you sit back and you realize all of the devastation that you have created in your life, but not only in your life, but all the lives of others. And what begins to happen is all these small things become bigger and bigger things, and all of it comes together like some gathering storm, and you realize that your whole life is unbelievable and inexcusable and unforgivable, that it had been better off if you hadn't been born. And what you realize is it does all seem incredibly unforgivable. And the reason it seems incredibly unforgivable is because we live in an unforgiving world. I mean, I don't know where this other Brian grew up, but I grew up in this small town, Lincoln, Illinois, 16,000 people. The people in Lincoln are going to forgive me for some of the things that I do. When you live in a town that is little, everything you do is loud. And everyone who knows about what you've done is always going to keep that asterisk by your name. And they will hold it over you and against you. It will lord it over, and you realize, I will never be forgiven. I will never be able to start over. It's unforgivable what I've done. I don't know what his family life was like. Maybe his family life was such a way in which he realized, I will never be forgiven. But for the rest of my life, my dad is going to think I'm a deadbeat. That for the rest of my life, because of what I've done, my mom will look at me and it will set her lip to trembling and she will weep. For the rest of my life, every time we sit down at the family dinner table, my brother and my sister are going to drag out all the crap I've done before, and I'm going to feel awful because it's unforgivable what I've done, and I'm not going to get forgiven here. And the church, you think the church is going to forgive me? I mean, these are the cats a couple years ago to put up all the signs on the highway about the 10 Commandments. What part of do you not understand? Love God, thanks. Because the church is supposed to be this place of refuge you run into, and it's all of these do's, and it's all of these do nots. It's a place you go to find grace, and you're only going to find law. It's unforgivable what I've done. And so if he's anything like me, there are moments where he would go home at night and he would want to punch the wall, and he would look in the mirror and he would want to scream at who he had become, that he would gnash his teeth when we wake up from a dream that he's had in which he was starting over, but to realize in reality that you don't get any do-overs. And there would be this moment where he would sit back and realize, it's over. This is all against me. There is no chance. This is unbelievable, inexcusable, unforgivable. It'd be better off if I'd never been born. That's me and him, Brian Philip Lowry, born April 4th, 1978, blonde hair, blue eyes. But where our stories diverge is that for me, there was some moment where I thought, but maybe. Because what had happened in my life is I had stumbled into this story that is written in a book that we call the Bible, that has been passed down from generation to generation. The brothers and sisters who are believers like us, with great precision and care, made sure that it was carefully recorded so that we would always have the story of what God has done through Jesus, to the point where all of the other historical documents, they pale in comparison to the precision and the accuracy. And we hold this story handed to us, and I held that story handed to me, and I stumble into these moments where I think to myself, maybe, because there is a man who is named Jesus who speaks of profound forgiveness and grace, who said in his ministry here on earth that all sins can be forgiven, who spoke of parables of a servant who was forgiven, who spoke of parables about forgiving someone 70 times 7 over, and who from even from the cross cried out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I thought maybe because he forgave Peter, And I thought maybe because, quite frankly, Judas could have been forgiven, because I think that's exactly what we are told through Peter in Acts chapter 2 when Peter stands before a throng of people, really stands before an entire crowd of Judases and says, this man who you crucified, God has made both Lord and Savior. That if you would believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, you will be forgiven. That when he would rise, and I heard that in the story, I went running to him because maybe. Now you know the rest of the story. But this other Brian, too much for him to wrap his imagination around. All the devastation, you know what, quite frankly, in a moment where all you tell yourself and maybe have others tell you that you are good at nothing and good for nothing, nothing's off the table, not even drug trafficking. Because, hey, if you're already good at destroying things, why not make a living out of it? And he did not do it literally, but at some point, this young man, born on the same day as me, slung a piece of rope over some low-hanging branch that was just high enough to do what he needed to do, and he hung himself. His imagination dead over the power of forgiveness that could be his. It destroys me. It destroys me to know that the story of this Brian Philip Lowry could have been the story of that Brian Philip Lowry, two men, one man. All the difference is what we each believed about what that one man offered us. You know what's going to destroy me today? What's going to destroy me today is if you are unable to wrap your mind around this reality and this truth, that he is risen, that you might run to him. And I know that every single one of you here, we're going to sing this song here in just a moment, How He Loves. And this song is a beautiful song in which we will cry out together how he loves us, and it blows our minds. And yet there will be so many moments in which this forgiveness is extended to you through Jesus Christ, that if you would believe and confess and repent and be baptized, you know, that is afforded to you. But I know sometimes what the pushback can be is you sit back and you think to yourself, no, you know what? This town is never going to forgive me for the things I've done because it's inexcusable, unbelievable, unforgivable. And you could absolutely be right. Because one of the things that I shared with the house church that we're a part of is, quite frankly, I think Plainfield, to be honest with you, I think Plainfield is kind of a tough place to start over. I think it is. Because it's a small town. And a town that's little, everything you do is loud. Man, I can't go running about in the town and say something like, I've been forgiven. They're not going to forgive me. And the truth is, you might be right about that. But you don't go running to the town of Plainfield. You go running to the only one who has risen. And he calls you friend. And the truth is, you could sit back and say, my family will never forgive me. Never. For the rest of my life, they will drag out everything that I have done and bring it up every time with cynical comments, sarcastic comments. They will never believe that I could ever be forgiven. And it seems about right, because what I've done is unbelievable, inexcusable, unforgivable. And you might be right. Your family might treat you like garbage for the rest of your life or never allow you to grow up in Jesus. But your family is not who you go running to. You go running to the only one who has risen and said for you to come running to him. And you are forgiven. And the thing that breaks my heart is, quite frankly, I don't know your story of what you've been through with the church. Quite frankly, you are probably scared to death to go run into a church because you think a church is not going to forgive me for the kinds of things that I've done. And the thing that shatters me is this truth. Churches are really good at shooting people as they run through our doors. It's pathetic. And you may be right that you'll find yourself in some church community that is constantly wanting to lord over you all of these do's and all of these do nots. But let me say something bold. It's not the church you come running to. It's the one who is risen. His name is Christ, and you are friend to him. It's the power of this story. And I don't care if you've run before to him and tasted that forgiveness. I know enough of each of you and stories that you've gone through that even this morning you walk through the door and there is something heavy that you just can't feel you can ever lay down. You run again because you are forgiven. Peter's story is your story. There is no desire in my heart today to give you enough rope to hang yourself. Not today, not any day, because it is Sunday, it is Resurrection Sunday, he is risen. And we run to him. Stand with me and let's sing this song together. God, you love us. We don't know why sometimes. But oh, how we love you as you love us. May you be honored and pleased by these songs that we sang. And after this song, when we take communion together, this simple meal that reminds us again that like with Peter, there your son is again at a shore. And if we must run, even if we must swim to him, we will. That we might be forgiven. It's ours to be had. So we run to you, the one who loves us.
He is jealous for me, loves like a hurricane, and I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. Like a hurricane, and I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. Sound great, church? When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. Sing that again. And oh, how he loves How